Good afternoon, Minnesota, and good afternoon to our press corps back again. It's a week of a lot of news and hopefully a lot of positive transitions in Minnesota. We're going to talk today about our administration's budget proposal, the COVID-19 recovery budget for Minnesota. You're going to hear from Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget, Jim Showalter. You'll hear from Steve Grove over at DEED, and I've also got folks here, Commissioner Dowdy from Revenue, his building that we're in, and Deputy Commissioner Mueller to talk about education. So we'll hear from a couple of them, but they're here to support your the questions that Minnesotans may have. Once again, I would just note this morning, and we have Commissioner Tomes here from Minute, that this morning we launched the site, and I'm happy to tell you that the volume was big, but maintained, that it was about, I have some numbers here, 2.2 seconds for pages to load. We already have 110,000 Minnesotans by my 9 a.m. brief this morning that had gotten in and got in the queue. The phone lines were taking people and they weren't on hold all that long. And some of the glitches, if you put in your wrong address, it might say there wasn't one available where you were at, and they fixed some of those. But it handled it. We're going to have a queue of several 100,000 Minnesotans as we expected. We'll be able tomorrow, after it closes tomorrow morning at 5 a.m., we'll be able to get out those invitations to folks where they'll be able to get their vaccines and move it through. And there's some really great stories that folks going on in groups that were, making sure that they were looking out for one another to get into that. So it sounds like at this point in time, that system is working. You also saw we put out a new dashboard to give some more granular details about where our vaccines are at. Also getting some good responses from our partners in this of ways that they can make it better. Just for example, our large pharmacy chains. Again, these are good partners trying to do what they're going to do. What they were doing was ordering second doses way ahead of time. And then those aren't for usage to get out there, but they're counting against the denominator of Minnesota where they're at. I think the interesting thing yesterday, and I'm really grateful for that we started to show, is that Minnesota's 12th in those second doses, meaning you have to get through both of these, and you have to do it for impact, which the health people keep telling us. The good news is we don't have any emergency crews or any emergencies at long-term care facilities, and no new facilities with infections, and in fact 80% have none at all. And so whether it's healthcare workers or whether it's skilled nursing facilities and long-term care, that vaccination for impact, especially the second dose, has been very effective, and you're starting to see that will continue. But once again, shortage of the vaccines, and I say this because last night you saw some of the news. Minnesota, and I want to thank the health department. Chris Erisman's here with us too. Our epidemiologists are here. As we've said many times, and CDC counts on Minnesota, we have a very robust public health department, especially on some of these monitorings. And Minnesota was the first place where we detected the Brazilian P1 variant of COVID-19. And I'd just like to remind folks before we get into the budget and we talk about the recovery from COVID-19, we're still deeply in the COVID crisis. The impact that it's had on families, on students, on small businesses has been dramatic. We're not done with it yet, but I want to note that have you handled this right in the beginning, what you're seeing around this, the ability of Minnesota's health department, and I will have to say this, the initiative of an individual to get tested allowed us to determine who this person was, who traveled with them, who their roommates were, who their roommates contacted, and that is going on as we speak, of making sure we close that loop on contact tracing and make sure that this Brazilian variant doesn't get out of control. For those who say, this is over, why do we need to test? This is exactly the reason why more than ever we need to test, contact trace, quarantine, isolate, and do the work that's necessary, because that is the next thing on this. If this variant proves to be true, like we're seeing in the UK, that it's up to 70% more infectious, we lose all of our progress. So I just want to make note of that. And with that being said, we're moving into this budget that we're going to announce. And as I've said time and time again, COVID-19 has not hit fairly across this country. It has impacted communities of color at a much greater rate. A lot of that has to do with systemic gaps in health disparities that existed beforehand. It hits students heavily just because of the nature of close contact in buildings, removing folks out. They're missing those opportunities for in-class learning, social emotional learning, as well as all of the things that make life so enjoyable. Being with your classmates, going to prom, playing sports, all of those things. Minnesota has taken an approach to slow this, which has allowed us to have fewer infections and allowed our death rates per 100,000 to stay lower. We've also been able to keep those economic activities that we're working moving forward. But there is absolutely no doubt recovering from COVID is going to take a concerted, deliberate effort. We are going to have to make sure that where those disparities were felt in schools, and what we did yesterday is unveiling a plan that will go hand in hand in that, of making sure we give those opportunities for students to pull back up and stay at grade level and move forward while we transform and make sure that every student learns in Minnesota. We're going to make sure that those working families that, whether through no fault of their own, were laid off their jobs or had to watch DC bicker for 9 months whether they would get extended unemployment insurance, we need to make sure that this budget supports them. And then we need to understand that this did not hit all businesses equally. I saw a note came on my phone this morning. Standard & Poor's is at a high based on incredible corporate earnings. We've seen that certain folks, while impacted negatively, there's been others that have done incredibly well because of the nature of COVID-19. So what we need to do is, as we always do on this, have a thoughtful budget that understands that this is more than a fiscal document, it is a moral document. So what you're going to see, and you'll hear from folks here, that the bulk of what we're asking to do is to invest in our children in education, making sure those investments for summer learning opportunities, and you can hear more about those, you heard some of those yesterday, are a big focus of what we're doing. We'll be expanding those summer programs, making sure we're prioritizing the entire well-being of students. Small business recovery we've already worked on. And this is not just in the short term, whether it be a forgivable loans that we're going to advocate for. Hopefully we see more out of the federal response. We're already starting to see this last COVID response bill and relief bill is making a difference, but making sure we're thinking about the future, things like angel tax credit. A few months ago, an article came out and talked about where the tech companies are going, and they said it's not Austin or Seattle, it's Minnesota was one of them. We have an ecosystem here that's thriving. We have great talent here, and we have a high quality of life. We can't jeopardize those by cutting to the bone the very things that make a difference. And then working families, making sure, and you're going to see this, our tax proposals will make sure that 1 million Minnesota families see a reduction in their tax rates and the impact that it makes on them, while also supporting their children in schools and while also supporting those services that folks need in a time of COVID-19. We're going to do this by sharing and focusing on the values that we care about. We know that when workers are supported, when children are supported, when quality of life is supported, it creates an economic environment where things thrive. And we're going to ask those that are most fortunate and those corporations that have profited during this time to pay a fair share to make sure that we can continue to provide the services we need. Most of those folks understand that very clearly because it's the workforce that they're going to need. It's their own children in schools. And so we think it makes sense, again, being very clear, and I know you'll hear this, that proposals around income tax are going to impact, as I said, 1 million Minnesotans will see as we expand the first tier. Well, so 1 million Minnesota families will see cuts to their income tax. We're going to ask the top 0.7% to pay a little bit more. So 1% on the 1% is about what we're looking at. And we think when you put this together in a progressive proposal that Minnesota's always done, a state that always takes care of our own, that is not dependent on the federal government, that we create an environment that Minnesota can be a thriving state where every child succeeds, where businesses have the opportunity to thrive, and that we take into consideration that we need to recover from COVID-19, continue the fight with COVID-19, to fund the programs like testing and contact tracing and the vaccine programs that will make a difference. So we'll get into a little bit more detail and certainly take questions from you. But what I can tell Minnesotans on this, that our budgeting that we did in 2019 produced a budget that created opportunities for all, that we made investments, historic investments in education, all the way from pre-K to our universities and state college systems. We made historic investments in housing. We made affordable insulin and drug prices a reality for folks. And we did that all by creating the largest surplus in one of the most sound fiscal states in the union. This budget will do that again. It will take in the realities of where we're at with COVID-19. It's fair in how it impacts people, and it does the things that I've said I would do, a responsible budget to make sure that we leave this state in good shape for future generations. With that, I'd like to introduce to you Minnesota Management and Budget Commissioner Jim Showalter.
Thank you, Governor. Good afternoon. I'm Jim Showalter, Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget, and was in this room just a few months ago being brought on by the Governor and telling me one of the key parts of my job would be to work with state agencies to craft a budget that reflects the Governor's values. Amidst all the challenges of this week, of all the challenges of last week, and the week before that, I'm proud of our team's ability to create a comprehensive budget that articulates that vision. We also make sure the math works out. And that's how we're going to start walking through the budget today. Last month, we presented an economic forecast where we announced a nearly $1.3 billion shortfall for the current budget period, fiscal years 22 and 23. That was a starting point for building Minnesota's COVID-19 recovery budget that we released today. Closing that gap is just part of the challenge. As Governor Walz just mentioned, due to the continued effects of COVID-19 pandemic, and despite the budget gap, we're making $1.3 billion in new investments for fiscal years 22 and 23. This net increase represents new spending, including $150 million in budget reductions, which, when taken together, focus on our highest priority areas. These include supporting small businesses and driving economic recovery, ensuring students catch up on learning, supporting working families. The largest investment, in fact, in this budget, and more than half of it, is in education. Minnesota's COVID-19 recovery budget invests $885 million in our kids and schools to respond to the pandemic's impact on students by expanding extensive summer learning programs in and outside of classrooms to help students catch up on learning, funding for mental health, and help support school personnel. It does so by supporting a more equitable education finance system throughout the state, providing funding to provide targeted supports to students most in need. It increases the basic education formula by 1% in the first year and 2.5% in the second year. It provides funding to address the cross-subsidy in special education, and funding to better address inequities in property tax capacity and local levies. Also, while doing that, we continue to support our public institutions of higher education. The budget also invests $235 million to support working families by establishing a paid family medical leave program, expanding the working family credit, supporting the creation and expansion of existing child care facilities. And lastly, for small businesses, jobs, and economic recovery, this budget invests $157 million to support small businesses impacted by the pandemic through emergency loans that the Governor mentioned, to reskill workers and support adult learners through workforce stabilization program, grow businesses through the Angel tax credits, and support broadband infrastructure. Commissioner Grove will go into more about the support for small businesses in just a minute. How does this all come together from the budget? Minnesota law requires that we balance the budget each biennium. To close our budget gap and have additional money to invest for Minnesotans, this budget uses a variety of solutions, including carrying over dollars from the current budget year, dipping into and using parts of our budget reserve and part of our stadium reserve, reducing budgets, and lastly, raising additional revenues. These are all in the one-pager that is available, and I'm going to walk through each of those components in a minute. The carryover part. Carryover from the previous fiscal year is the first step in helping us close the budget gap while continuing to invest in the state. In the recovery budget, Governor Walz proposes $176 million in new investments in the current year, in fiscal 21. While being the biennial budget, we're starting that budget right now because the needs and impacts of COVID-19 are real and they're imminent and urgent. So we start this year. Those investments include funding for summer learning and emergency support for small businesses. The new spending in the current year reduces the amount we can carry forward, reducing the amount we can help to address the gap in the next biennium. But thankfully, the federal government has provided significant resources in January, and that helps pay for some of the testing and vaccination. Also provides other resources for other parts of the budget. That means we're still able to carry over $217 million to help address the 22 and 23 budget gap. The budget reserve is also tapped. As I mentioned in November, uncertainty had led to questions about the rainy day fund and whether it would be needed. It is certainly raining, and our rainy day fund is not needed for this current year, but we are drawing $1 billion from the reserve as a buffer for the projected shortfall in the next biennium to help provide services and get us through this period. That still leaves $847 million in the reserve, which is prudent because we know there's still more uncertainty, and the current pandemic is not behind us. And just in case you're wondering, it's still more in a better position than we were when we were facing the Great Recession about 10 years ago. Experience has taught us the value of the reserve, how it's allowed us to buy time, make better decisions with better information. Minnesota's COVID-19 recovery budget caps the stadium reserve at $100 million. As you know from the forecast, you'll see that there's been a significant growth in the size of that reserve. At $100 million, it's more than enough to handle any unexpected reductions in revenue, as annual stadium costs are approximately $44 million. During this time of great need, these additional resources can be used to make sure we're meeting the needs of Minnesotans. Due to this cap, an additional $130 million will be transferred to the general fund in fiscal years 22 and 23. As Governor Walz so clearly articulated, the pandemic has had inequitable and devastating impacts to many Minnesotans. We're asking those who have weathered this time relatively well to help out those who have not. Minnesota's COVID-19 recovery budget raises $1.6 billion in additional revenue while cutting taxes for working families. The additional revenue will allow us to respond to the needs resulting from the pandemic and to position our state in a better place once our economy fully recovers. We could have solved our budget whole by using reserves and savings and balances, but that would have left tremendous needs in education, for helping families in need, and businesses struggling to survive, and leaving all those needs unmet. So I'm going to go through some of the key components of the revenue package. It includes expanding and increasing the working family credit for more than 300,000 Minnesotans. Households would see an average increase in the tax credit of approximately $160 starting in tax year 2021. A cut for more than 1 million taxpayers by expanding the first tier of the individual income tax. Establishment of a fifth tier for the wealthiest Minnesotans, filers whose household income, married couple, have incomes over $1 million. This raises more than $400 million, and 99.3% of Minnesotans will not be affected by this fifth tier. An increase in the capital gains tax and corporate tax will make a big difference in investments and will help us to reduce after-tax income gaps in Minnesota. Also proposing reinstating the estate tax exclusion at $2.7 million. However, and knowing the harsh impact the pandemic has had on small businesses and on farms, both maintain full access to the $5 million exclusion. In addition, closing corporate loopholes by capturing tax on foreign income as it's repatriated. Modifying sales tax exemption for new and existing qualified data center software purchases by decreasing the period of exemption from 20 to 5 years, and limiting the refund to 50% of the sales tax paid on all software purchases after June 30th, 2021. In total, while crafting this budget, we always said that everything is on the table, and indeed everything was. We're creating a recovery budget by using cash in hand, dipping into reserves, reducing spending, and raising additional revenues. These are all necessary to balance our budget and fund the initiatives that will help Minnesota recover and thrive as we emerge from this pandemic. Before I close, I want to note that this budget leaves $470 million on the bottom line, along with $847 million in budget reserve to help prepare for the future and close the projected gap that we'll have in 24 and 25. The resilience of our economy is one of the reasons that Governor Walz has successfully managed state finances with 3 years of budget surpluses. The Walz administration is committed to balancing the budget while investing to rebuild our economy and build a better future. This is in contrast to cutting to the bone and refusing to ensure that the wealthy and profitable corporations pay their fair share. These cuts would hurt vulnerable Minnesotans at a time when they need support the most, especially our seniors and children. Minnesota's COVID-19 budget makes strategic investments while closing our budget gap and leaving money on the bottom line for the next budget. I want to thank my team at MMB who have worked diligently to put this proposal together. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Commissioner Steve Grove.
Well, thanks, Commissioner, Governor. Good afternoon, Minnesota. My name is Steve Grove. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Employment and Economic Development. And certainly we're happy to be up here talking today about economic growth after talking so many times at this podium about the challenges that our economy has faced time and again due to the struggles brought upon by COVID-19. Of course, responding to that pandemic is something we've been doing throughout the months of this pandemic. In the past year, we've launched 4 separate small business support programs, including a $215 million package last December, voted across with bipartisan support. And we've paid out over $9.7 billion to Minnesotans in our unemployment insurance program. Over 800,000 Minnesotans have gotten this benefit, many of whom never believed in a million years they'd be in a situation in which they'd need help from the state. But of course, our work is not over. The pandemic is still here, and so much more needs to be done to support our businesses in this state as they get on a strong footing for growth in the months ahead. And it's really in these times of great challenge when your government needs to come in and help empower our economy to grow when it needs that help to survive. We've spoken to thousands of businesses over the last months of the pandemic, and one thing is clear. While the pandemic has been challenging for so many parts of the economy, it has also been an uneven amount of challenge. On the one hand, you've got a sector like the hospitality industry that's really struggling. And then you've got manufacturers or home builders who can't hire people fast enough. And when you look at workers in our state, workers in communities of color and lower wage jobs have suffered far more than the rest of us who can work from home. And there are some stunning statistics on this. If you're a black worker in Minnesota, there's a 67% chance that you have filed for unemployment insurance in the last year. And if you're a worker who earns less than $14.70 an hour, in the pre-COVID-19 period, you are the most likely to still be out of work as of last fall. So what we hear consistently from both businesses and workers is that we need to focus on helping the workers who are most affected by this pandemic and helping small businesses thrive as we begin our recovery as a state. The governor's COVID-19 recovery budget does just that. Commissioner Showalter mentioned the tax breaks for those at the lower end of the income ladder. This is the tier of our tax bracket that charges 5.35% income tax. Expanding that to include another million workers in that bracket will make a big difference for working families. And the working family tax credit, this is an incredible benefit for middle-class families in our state. 72% of those who get that working family tax credit are families with 1 or more kids. And research shows irrefutably that when that tax credit is given, it leads to improved infant and maternal health, the reduction of poverty, the boosting of our economy, and it leads to better academic performance in families as well. And so under the governor's proposal, expanding that tax credit to over 300,000 households will see an increase of $160 in the pockets of working families. Now, we can't let up on immediate economic relief for businesses affected by the events of the last year. We are not out of the woods yet, and many Minnesota businesses do face some lean months ahead. And we're hopeful about the federal aid that could be coming, additional federal aid, and of course, optimistic about the vaccine, but your state government needs to be there for you too. And so one of the key proposals of the governor's recovery budget is to put another $50 million into a forgivable loan program for businesses affected by COVID-19, particularly those hospitality businesses that have been the most hurt, with specific carve-outs for businesses who face the biggest uphill climbs. Half of that money is going to go to Greater Minnesota. We suggest targeted amounts for very small businesses, 6 or fewer, and to businesses who are led by underrepresented groups in our economy and those operating in cultural malls across the state. We also recommend the set aside of $250 million in appropriation bonds to help rebuild the corridors of both Minneapolis and St. Paul that were affected by the civil unrest following the killing of George Floyd. $150 million of that will go through our Department of Employment and Economic Development. We've got to help the heart of our biggest cities in the state come back so that we can see our entire state economy thrive due to the rebuilding that needs to take place there. Now, as we look kind of beyond the rescue moment that we've been in for so long and into kind of the longer term growth, we have to make sure we're making the smartest possible investments as a state to help our businesses grow in the months ahead. And that means we really need to focus a lot on small businesses. Half of Minnesotans work for a small business, and studies show in recessions that nearly all of the net new job growth that comes during these downturns comes from small businesses. The good thing is in recessions, more small businesses get started. It's always a period where people are trying new things. They're either forced to by circumstance or they see a disruption. And so we are doubling down on small businesses in our state. We are lucky in Minnesota to have a business climate that is #1 in the nation for starting a new business. If you start a new business in Minnesota, it is more likely to be around 5 years from now than any other state in our country. And so we've got to capitalize on that strength and deepen our investments there. We are proposing additional investments for our small business development centers across the state. These are outfits where we help small business owners get some technical assistance and get started on that journey to building a business, which can be a lonely venture unless you've got some help. We're suggesting $6 million in funding for business incubators and technical assistance providers to help small businesses, particularly those owned by entrepreneurs of color. And as the governor said, we have got to double down on the world-class technology sector we have in this state. We are proposing $5 million for our flagship program for entrepreneurs. It's called Launch Minnesota. It helps attract talent to our state and grow the ecosystems across Minnesota for startup growth and technology. We got to double down on the angel tax credit. This brings in money from all across the country to Minnesota to invest in our startups here. And the governor's right. People are leaving Silicon Valley. They're looking for other places to live, especially now that we've kind of taken the cap off of working virtually anywhere. We want entrepreneurs to choose Minnesota because of the talent here, and we need the levers to exist to make that possible. These are the startups that are really going to create the next Fortune 500s in Minnesota. And importantly, they should be able to create those startups anywhere in our state. And that's why broadband is a huge component of this budget. $50 million is what the governor is proposing for investments in our border-to-border grant program. This gets broadband into communities that the telecoms might not otherwise be incentivized to get to. You may think that you've got good broadband, or you may think you don't. The reality is only 75% of households in Minnesota have really the truly high-speed internet that you need to be able to start or run a business from your home, or even just engage in kind of basic commercial activity. So we've got to double down on broadband so that the whole state can thrive. Now, as we build for this path for growth, we've got to put workers first. And that means looking at the unique effects of this pandemic on our labor market and really investing in training and reskilling as huge priorities in the months to come. Again, even though jobless claims are high right now, there's so many jobs that are actually available that you can step into right away, or with just a little bit of reskilling that can shift your skill set and make it possible to take on a new profession if that's in your future. We're seeing a huge amount of trend lines on automation and digital technology rapidly changing the workforce and the opportunities that are out there, and we need to make sure Minnesotans are ahead of that curve. One of the big things that the governor is proposing is modernizing the state's workforce development fund. This is one of the hidden secrets of our talent ecosystem. No other state in the country has this fund. Employers pay into it. It's a small payroll tax. We at our department use it to build a talent ecosystem that then serves those businesses across our state. The fund was built back in the 80s. It's a great fund, but it needs to be modernized for the challenges of a modern workforce. And so we are updating that fund, proposing changes that will make it more equitable, create more innovation in that fund, and create some common performance metrics so businesses know exactly what they're getting out of our workforce development in the state. Mr. Showalter mentioned $35 million in workforce stabilization grants, and we're also going to invest in grants that help companies automate and then train their workers in that automation space. Now, in the last year, our social safety net is something that we have had the chance to look at pretty critically, as we've had to take care of so many Minnesotans who were dislodged from work because of the pandemic. And life happens to so many Minnesotans who don't have a safety net when it does. In normal times, 10% of Minnesota workers take a family or medical leave in any given year. And over 25% of those workers who do not have any wage replacement. So they're just on their own. They're either off to take care of a baby or a sick loved one, and they have not a single dime to tide them over during that period of time. This is an issue that the United States is woefully behind on. It's something that even our former president and Republicans in Congress think that we need to take action on, and it's something that states across the country are showing is possible. A paid family medical leave program will help workers, and particularly smaller businesses, provide this benefit for the cost of a cup of coffee per week per worker. A critical program to make the social safety net in our state work and to help create the kind of environment that attracts workers from across the country. We got investments in child care and other worker supports, but I want to mention unemployment insurance as well, because this is a program the whole state's kind of gotten an education in this year. And one of the things many of you have learned, and certainly we've seen for some time at DEED, is that we have a very antiquated law on the books on unemployment insurance that prevents high school students from getting that benefit, even though their employers pay into that system for them. And this isn't just spending cash for your high schooler during the summer. These dollars go to helping support working families where children actually contribute to the money that puts food on the table. And the law that prohibits that in our state is from 1939, super antiquated. We've got to repeal that and get UI to young people. Throughout this whole budget, you'll see a huge focus on equity. We know that Black and brown Minnesotans have been disproportionately affected by this pandemic, and it's really not just a moral imperative to start with equity in this budget. It is an economic imperative. 70% of the growth in our labor force in the next 10 years is going to be people of color. Economists predict if we close the racial wealth gap in our country, we would see a U.S. GDP growth of about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. So the data is just clear as can be. When economies close gaps, they not only become more fair, they become more efficient and prosperous for all Minnesotans. So downturns in our economies there are times of extraordinary challenge, but there are also times of big opportunity. During the last recession, you saw in this country great companies created: WhatsApp, Instagram, Venmo, Uber, just to name a few. You saw Microsoft created in the stagflation of the 70s, General Electric during recessions in the 1870s. We think Minnesota, which is a state with a great economy, a diverse economy, a great value proposition to businesses, is really well positioned to be the kind of state where companies can come to solve the next big challenges that we face. We've got a highly educated workforce, a tax climate that really provides a quality of life that empowers workers across the state. If you look at the business taxes in our state compared to GDP, it's just 4.3%, which is the 15th lowest in the nation. Businesses tell me all the time, it is a bargain to come and build a company here. Just yesterday, I was talking with a company called Arctic Wolf. It's a cybersecurity company headquartered in Silicon Valley, billion-dollar company, decided to come to Minnesota because of the talent that awaits them. Not here because of the cost issues or things like that, but because they could find the kind of employees they could build the next chapter of their company on. So this is going to be a great recovery for Minnesota. We think we're strongly positioned. We've got to invest in our workers and our businesses to get there, and we're thrilled to work with businesses all along the way in that journey. Thanks, everybody. Back to you, Governor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Well, before I take questions, I want to note, and I want to thank these two commissioners, the whole team, but especially these two right now in this moment. Commissioner Showalter has served multiple governors. He's also was there the last time Minnesota faced a budget deficit in the Great Recession of 2009, helped lead us through that. So the state has talent of someone who is focused on fiscal responsibility as well as sharing those values of making sure every Minnesotan has the opportunity to thrive. And Commissioner Grove has been tasked during the pandemic like no other commissioner at DEED ever has. And I think the folks who work over there day in and day out, all too often, a lot of folks don't see that, but they have been recognized as being both for efficiency in how fast they got out unemployment insurance and accuracy of how much they prevented fraud from this, recognized as one of the top 2 states in the nation for doing that. These are things that Minnesota does. It's why we take care of our own. We take care of our neighbors, we make things work. Now, with this budget out there, as I said yesterday, here's how this will work. We'll get some budget numbers, hard numbers in February. We will readjust our budget according to those numbers slightly. That happens every time. And now, from now until that 3rd week of May, the legislature will poke holes or try and say things, and they will have to develop their own budget. This is a good thing, Minnesota. It lets us debate the direction we want to go. This is a healthy thing. The thing I would ask is, and I would ask of the folks in this room, to make sure that we level set what the reality is, what the real numbers are. You're going to hear a lot about tax increases, and I want to be very clear about this. They're going to tell all of the folks listening today you're going to see a tax increase. That is simply false. Income tax that we're talking about will hit 0.7% of the population. 99.3% of people will not see that. In fact, over 1 million families will see a cut in that. But the impacts you will see is a historic impact in education with a historic coalition that's ready to try and challenge the status quo to make a difference for all of our children. And the ability to continue to fight COVID-19. If you could craft a budget where you didn't have to, or you could pretend that COVID wasn't real, it might look different. But we've seen a lot of people try and do that. We saw the last outgoing administration in DC do that, and now we have a situation where the United States is in worse shape from COVID and financially than almost any other state trying to respond to it. And I'd like to note for people, this isn't about trying to divide us. This is about a progressive taxation system that says much is required of much that's given to some folks. And I saw Oxfam did a study and BBC reported on this. The top 10 richest people in the world increased their wealth during the pandemic by $540 billion. If that $540 billion was put into, it is enough to pay for and vaccinate every single person on the planet. They would still be the 10 richest people in the world. And the pandemics exposed so many things, but income inequities and a federal tax system that benefited a few over the many. And I would also ask, as this debate goes on, you're going to hear a lot about asking to cut. And from hiring freezes to becoming more efficient, that's absolutely what people should ask us to look at what we're doing. But I want people to not just say generalized, an across-the-board cut. Did you want me to cut the epidemiologist who found the Brazilian variant? Did you want me to cut the state patrol officer who was protecting cities or out on the highways at night? Be specific about what you want us to do, and let us understand what that impact is to Minnesotans. If it means cutting a teacher or support to teachers, let Minnesotans then decide what type of state do they want to live in. Don't just overly generalize. And as I said last time in my budget, have the courage to tell people that you get what you pay for, and that you don't just get to make it up and pretend that the roads build themselves and the schools are great on their own, and that you have a discussion about how that works. That's our pledge to you. We created a 2-year budget in 2019 that did all of those things. We're prepared to do that again. Even though COVID-19 is here, we have the capacity to do exactly that. And with that, any of us will be glad to take questions. Mary?
Governor, as you may have guessed, Senator Gazelka has already responded and said they will not be doing tax increases and said, quote, this is not the answer for people who have suffered enough.
Again, if that 0.7%, and again, I'm sure in that, folks, many of them are more than willing to pay their fair share. Many of them have probably been impacted by COVID. But this gross generalization of this idea, we are making the case that those who have suffered from COVID, and I might add, because many people denied COVID, many people gathered, encouraged people not to wear masks, or dismissed some of the things we were doing, and here's where we're at. To be very clear, our businesses are suffering more in the United States because the president and his enablers were unwilling to take COVID seriously. Google right now what they're doing in New Zealand, since it's a New Zealand summer right now. They're gathering for concerts together unmasked with no COVID spread because they had the courage to follow the science and do things right. So I'm not surprised. We saw this at the federal level. The Trump tax cuts benefited a very small percentage of people. Every economist across the board with any credibility will tell you that did not create in more jobs. It ended up buying back stocks and increasing the wealth of the folks who were there.
So could I follow up? Is there a path to get this through the Senate? Could you try and get some Republicans to break off and join minority Democrats and get it through?
Yeah, I think so. They're going to hear from their constituents. But I'd like you to hear the language here. My language was everything's on the table. Yep, we'll try and find places we can become more efficient. Yep, there's things that I want to do I can't do now that were in my budget last time that I'm not able to do this time for that. And I'm more than willing to have this conversation. But when you have people who take a pledge, again, if the economy's good, cut taxes. If the economy's bad, cut taxes. Being very specific on a very smart, apparently, group of folks who will bestow on the rest of us what we're going to need to get. So I'm not surprised. This is the most predictable thing. But what I'm saying is, yes, I'm willing to compromise. Yes, I'm willing to hear you. But I'll tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to compromise on the safety of Minnesotans. And I'm not going to compromise on us recovering, especially for our students, small businesses, and those working families. So if they can provide a way to tell me how cutting school funding benefits those students who've had to deal with COVID, if they can tell me how giving tax breaks to the 0.7% would benefit Minnesotans and build out of this, I'll listen to them. But that's the debate that now has to happen. And it's the debate I'm encouraging Minnesotans to engage in, this overly simplistic, and I want to say it again, Be very specific when you ask what you're going to cut, because it's so interesting to tell the public, we're going to cut government. Well, the public will say that's great. And then we're going to tell them, yeah, we're going to cut your kid's school. Oh, don't do that. We're not going to build the road in front of your house. Oh, don't do that. We're going to pull state patrol off the road. Oh, don't do that. We have to have that very granular discussion. And that's what we tried to put into this budget. That's where we tried to be thoughtful about what was the impact of COVID and how do we best build out of it. Go ahead.
Governor, it just seems like you're aiming very high here. We're going to hear from the Republicans in a little bit. But what would you tell Minnesotans?
Would you tell me how I'm aiming high?
Well, sir, certainly with these programs for the summer programs, it sounds like you're trying to hit every single possible student go to a summer program. I mean, that's a big, big thing. I mean, my question is, people are going to hear this, they're going to hear the Republican response, and they're going to think, oh my God, for the next 5 months, we're going to hear this back and forth, and we're not going to get anything. Realistically, what, if any of this, can you really get through, considering the division and considering you've got smaller margins in both the House and Senate?
Yeah, there's a small margin of Republican senators in the Senate and a small margin in the House. We are the only state with divided government. They are going to hear this, but that's democracy. And what's not democracy is starting a debate saying, no, I'm not willing to hear you. I'm not willing to hear you. The fact of the matter is, when we ask Minnesotans, fair revenues on those who much was given and who did do very well during the pandemic, 1% on the 1% is a very reasonable proposition for folks if they believe, and that's what we're telling them, it's going to be reinvested in things that grow the economy. So this is healthy. This will be a debate. I'm not going to compromise on our students. I would not say that it's aiming high. Every single student, and I made this clear, this is a zero-sum proposition, needs to have the opportunity to catch up on that education, for those opportunities to go forward. And we need to see that systemic change to make sure that some of those, again, if systemic racism is causing us problems, then you need systemic change to fix it. If we're having systemic issues around the achievement gap, you systemically change it. So I'm not willing to go halfway on things that make that, but I've left things out of here that I wanted to do last time that we're simply not in the position to do that, and you have to prioritize. But what you're hearing is cuts straight across the board and cut taxes or don't have people pay their fair share. The situation then is we have to pay for the recovery of COVID, and we have to understand that what we made a mistake nationally on in 2019 during the Great Recession is some communities recovered very quickly. We still have communities that haven't recovered. Now they've been hit by this. We're not going to make that mistake in Minnesota. Ricardo?
Thank you, Governor. My question is, between the new fifth-tier income tax proposal, capital gains tax, a higher corporate franchise tax rate, it seems like this plan is very much aimed squarely at the state's highest earners, the largest corporations. I mean, would you describe this as a tax-the-rich budget? And how do you build momentum from those who would be affected for a budget proposal as expansive as this in such a short amount of time?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, it's a fairness of people paying their fair share. We've always believed in this country, even Republicans have believed in a progressive taxation system that makes sense for the most fortunate, pay a little more on that. What we do know is that COVID impacted small business. Again, just so people out there are listening, if your family is making less than $20,000 per week, this isn't going to hit you. This is $20,000 per week that we're talking about, and it's 1% on those folks. And that ability, just like I gave you the example of the 10 richest folks, gives us the ability to impact lives that are the very workers that work in those large companies, that are the very folks that are serving, whether they are working in those companies, whether they're cleaning those buildings of those companies, whatever it may be. So I'm going to make the case to Minnesotans that I think they've seen this and why Minnesota's thrived, that this makes sense. And again, I will add this. We just got, and I have it in my budget, I'm going to ask the legislature to pass it, our personal care attendants. Folks who take care of folks, get them up in the morning, give them a shower, get them dressed, do the things to provide dignity to their lives. Why should you pay more tax carrying someone to a shower to help them than you do carrying interest or capital gains? That makes absolutely no sense. That's not fair. That's not paying your fair share. And that's what we're trying to make sure we have happen. Yes, go ahead.
Governor, normally how this works is there's a big pile up in May of all these proposals, and the full budget is set in a weekend. seems like there's some time-sensitive things in here, whether it be the summer schools will need time to know whether it's coming, the COVID relief for the businesses, the additional money. Are there parts in here that you're going to peel off and ask the legislature to act on immediately or in very short order instead of waiting until May to get it done?
We will, but I think, Brian, you know how hard this is because there's a lot of moving pieces and you peel one thing off to try and get them there. You're absolutely right. I think there's time sensitive around COVID relief. We need the money now. We need to be able to do that. And I just want to be clear with everyone on this announcement of this. Before I came to you to announce today, I could have written the press releases that my Republican friends were going to put out. This is kind of just the thing that we go through. But I want to highlight, this morning, I had very cordial and productive conversations with both Leader Gazelka and Leader Dowd. Very respectful, very cordial, very ideologically different. I mean, that's kind of what politics is and how we do this. But I am hopeful. But yes, I would hope we could get to this. But I have to be totally candid here. We fundamentally disagree on a lot of things. One of the things we fundamentally have been disagreeing about now for 10 months is that COVID-19 is real. It poses a threat, and there are certain set of things that you can do to address it that reduce that threat and give us a better opportunity. So I hope, again, that there's that sense of that our students need these summer opportunities, that this education coalition was very counterintuitive and very unusual that you saw yesterday, and it started a spark, which I was hoping it would, across folks who care about this. And I heard many things from folks yesterday. And so I hope that gives some incentive to get it done. But it's hard.
And what's your expectation that the federal government is going to pass another unrestricted state and local government relief plan that you could perhaps substitute some of the revenue increases or reserve use that you have in this budget?
Yeah, we're already seeing some of the benefits of the last one. Commissioner Showalter, we were talking this morning, for example, assistance around transit that is federal. So a lot of transportation things are federal responsibilities. We built this budget using what we already have, but not pie in the sky hoping they do it. If you want my opinion on this, I think there's a very good chance we'll see another relief bill. Again, I think President Biden probably ideologically is pretty close to where I'm at. He put a proposal that I think is needed. It's $1.9 trillion. He will not get that. And what he will probably get is something in between. We think that'll be there, but it is not fiscally prudent for us to plan on that. Now, I will say this. If that happens and it comes in March, which is some of the dates we've been hearing, that certainly changes some of the calculus of where they're at. If they're in to help us with summer programming for schools, that certainly helps us. And again, instead of drawing that fine line in the sand and said, nope, this is dead on arrival, won't be there, I'll adjust accordingly, depending what the federal government does. Peter?
This is for MMB, if you guys could switch with me. Following up a little bit on Brian's question, rather than talking about additional help that might come from the federal government, without jinxing it, can you give us a look at February and see what you expect based, say, on the January IHS market update and the impact that could have in February?
Sure. I'll give you a thumbnail sketch because, as the governor said, he is required to release a budget today. And he's basing it on the November forecast and what we know in the economy that was included in that forecast. We have to take in account the money that was carried forward or we estimate is going to be there this fiscal year, plus projections going forward. In February, we're going to relook at that. What we do know is a couple things have changed. We know that at the time of the November forecast, we didn't have a second stimulus bill. So we can hope, and we know has been a second stimulus bill since then. So that will be part of the economic forecast that's built into the February forecast. Still a lot of other risks, still a lot of uncertainties, but that will be part of it. I think the second thing is just the continued question of the path of the pandemic. And that will also affect the national economic forecast. I'm not here to speculate what's going to happen in February. I wish I knew. I'd tell you if I knew. But I don't, and that's the work that's still ahead. But for today, the question is how do we respond to the pandemic? How do we respond knowing what we know today and continue iterating as the governor said?
Okay, and can you say what the total of your supplemental budget is?
Total of our supplemental budget?
Meaning what are you going to spend between now and July 1?
Yeah, it's on the sheet. Let's see, well, it's certainly the $1.3 billion over the 3-year period. You're looking for the amount in the current year? I'll get you that. It's a little over $100 million.
Yeah, how much am I deducting from your surplus?
Yeah.
You can give it to me later, that's fine.
Commissioner, while you're up there also, the corporate franchise tax increase, it says in here that it's for profitable corporations. How is that exactly delineated in terms of which corporations are going to actually pay more?
I'll start, but I will ask my colleague, Commissioner Doty, to join me because he is the expert on these things. Rather than getting into his territory, I'm going to ask him to help me on that one. This is a phone a friend moment. Let them know who you are.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert Doty, Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Revenue. And yes, that would be on profitable corporations. And with that, we're looking at corporations that have shown a profit in the prior, really in fiscal year 2020. And then they would be then assessed on that corporate franchise tax.
And so does that mean that corporations who did not would still be at the 9.8% rate?
Yeah, you're correct. They would still get that 9.8% rate.
Okay, and so you already know how much this is going to generate. That's based on that. I'm a little surprised just because it's so early in the year. How do you know that?
Yeah, the amount that generates is, hold on a sec, just so I'm clear.
It says 424 million.
23 million, yes.
How do you know that already? Maybe I just don't understand corporate franchise tax forecasting. But.
I mean, that's from our tax research division, looking at various variables that go into that. I'm sorry, what was that? Oh, that's from our research folks have put that together. So I would need to get more details into how they prepared that estimate.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner, while you're up there, can I do a follow-up related? How many corporations do you anticipate being affected by this increase?
That would affect, I don't think we have the number affected. I can get that for you though.
Can you give us a ballpark or a sense of, what type of corporations? Are we talking big, small, any info?
I hate to try to give a ballpark on that, but what I can tell you is that these would be organizations that are organized as C corporations. So, I mean, there are large C corporations, obviously, and there are smaller C corporations. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag, to be honest with you.
Commissioner Doty? Just wanted to ask about the first tier tax expansion. I'm curious, I know that's based on earnings, but do you have an estimate of roughly how big of a tax cut folks will be seeing on average?
Say that one more time.
For the first tier.
The first tier, right. So what was your question? I'm sorry, say it one more time.
I'm just curious how big of a tax cut folks can expect on average.
Sure. On average, that would affect a little over 1 million taxpayers, and that would be a decrease in their liability of around $36 per return.
And what's the upper limit going to for the? Yeah, but what's the upper limit going to for the first tier?
Upper limit for the first tier.
That's not in any of the materials.
Let's see here, sorry. So in terms of who it affects, so this would affect taxpayers who are making $1 million or more for married filing jointly, $750,000 for those head of household, and $500,000 for single taxpayers.
I was talking about the tax cut to the first tier, not this new fifth tier, but the first tier that's being expanded upward so that some people get a tax cut? What's it going to?
What is the tax cut going to?
No. The upper limit is currently at roughly $39,000
Yep.
for married filing jointly, 27,000 for single filers. You're expanding it upward.
Right.
What is it going to?
Right. I mean, I don't have that in terms of what the actual, so. 40.
Okay. Governor, I do have a question for you also. Thank you. You're calling for $150 million for businesses in Minneapolis and St. Paul that were riot damaged. How'd you arrive at that number? And then you may know the legislature, there was a lot of controversy around this similar program last year. Do you think it has any better chances this year?
Well, I hope so. 39,810, I think, is the number for marriage, but so you know on the top of your one. So I've got, yeah, the issues around the death of George Floyd. We saw an unprecedented amount of civil unrest. Some of that turned into civil disobedience and crime in arsons and other things. We're making the case that as one Minnesota, like we do, whether it's flooding, whether it's tornadoes, whether it's crop damage, things like that, that we work together to try and make a fund to help folks out. And those were the claims that were put out there. We think it makes sense. I'm certainly working with the legislature. I thought something we did that was really smart. We had the disaster contingency account that we've used from everything from ice on milk barns falling in to mud in fields where we couldn't get potatoes out. We've used it across the spectrum for things. We're asking for this contingency account to help rebuild those corridors, to make sure that we understand that that benefits all Minnesotans. And we came up with it based on the claims that people put, I believe, Jim, if that's correct.
Governor, a couple questions on some of the spending initiatives in here. We are still in a pandemic, as you've noted. Is there any additional money or substantial increase in public health spending to prepare us for perhaps what comes ahead?
Yeah, and we could bring it up on vaccine proposals. Again, we're still able to use some of the federal money on this. Our big concern, of course, as we were going through election season and December 31st was the end of that money. We do think there's going to be added expenses around vaccines, added expenses around testing, added expenses around PPE. What we're starting to see now, though, is the federal government is already stepping in and starting to change some of those calculations. They will pay 100% for the Guard when we use them on that. They'll pay for all PPE. Jim, you can talk some of the specifics. There still will be costs.
That's absolutely right, Governor. There's still going to be significant costs for testing, for COVID response, for vaccination planning. The good news is that coming out of the calendar year, the state still had ability to take money that was left over from previous year and continue its efforts on testing and vaccination as we try to wait for and collect information on how to use that federal money. We've got more than $300 million coming in help for testing from that last stimulus bill. Significantly less, I think it's around more like $50 million for the vaccination effort. There's going to need to be more, but that is sort of a work in progress at this point. And as the governor said, this information is literally changing by the day as to some of the arrangements that the new administration is going to be proposing for vaccination or other costs.
And a question on the education spending here. The pot of money for the declining enrollment or the lost students due to COVID, is that 100% recovery? Does it go back to a prior year to use the calculation, or should schools expect that they're only getting a portion of the money back for students they've lost attributable to COVID?
I'm going to use that opportunity to call another friend, Deputy Commissioner Heather Mueller.
Thank you. So what it's going to give us the opportunity to do is it will go back to looking at the enrollment percentages for last year, and it will also take into account a specific amount of dollars. And so it's essentially per pupil who left the public school and went into a different type of program, it would add an additional approximately, counting the dollars, I think it's almost, I'm not sure, $1,300 that are going to be a total that are going to be assigned to that particular student. And so it really is based on the per pupil amount that left.
Assistant Commissioner, can I follow up? Do you have updated numbers on how many kids have left the public school? I know for a fact additional children left during the break and went private. Do you have updated after the Christmas holiday break?
Well, what we utilize for this information is actually the October 1 numbers. And so we are continuing to gather that information and look at what, any additional data is coming out of the winter break. But at this point in time, this enrollment data was based on the October 1st data.
But do you have a sense of that? Do you have any sense if it's dozens, hundreds, thousands more kids who have left public school?
No, I don't have it.
Hi.
Every family would be able to access summer school programs, everybody who's got a 4 or 5-year-old, and how are you going to make sure this is accessible? What's kind of the goal here, and is the goal to try and include every child that wants it?
Well, the goal, I think, the governor's really articulated is to be able to ensure that every student that needs to have access and wants to have access does have access. We also are cognizant of the fact that that's inclusive of what's happening in academics. Oftentimes, there are parameters that are set on who would be able to attend a summer program, and we're really looking at expanding what those parameters look like. It's also not only the academic components, but also looking at maybe operating and supporting tutoring with our partners in nonprofit organizations that we can partner with. In addition, so helping to support like mental health supports and services, partnering with our DHS community colleagues, as well as ensuring that we have access to counselors, social workers, school psychologists, and school nurses throughout the summer to be able to help support that work. We also are trying to expand the definition of what that looks like. So it's not just school based on a school program, it's also working within communities. We recognize that sometimes our students in the summer, their work is to help to support their siblings while their families are at work. And so we want to make sure that if a student wants to be able to participate in summer programming and needs to be able to participate in summer programming, that we can work to, schools will have the opportunity to apply for grants to be able to move into communities, whether that's apartment buildings or parks, and bring that school out to them. I think it's really redefining how it is that we are going to be able to offer supports and services to our students.
I saw that the broadband was in the business bucket. Broadband obviously has also been a huge factor in the problems with schools and education. Was there going to be some overlap there? Because a lot of families are saying that's their problem, the broadband issue.
That was a great question, Esme. Broadband, obviously, if you didn't know about this issue before the last year, you know about it now, given so many families and schools and businesses have had to rely on it. Our grant program does get broadband into sections of the economy that wouldn't otherwise be incentivized to lay lines by our telecoms. A lot of these schools don't have the infrastructure to lay that money in, and so there's also federal dollars that we work with through a program called RDOF that helps on some of the capacity building pieces of this. And then where the federal government comes in too is they help subsidize some of the costs of broadband for low-income families. So whether it's families or schools or businesses, and I'll add telehealth to that list too as another key section of the economy that depends on broadband as more and more Minnesotans access healthcare remotely. This is a big issue, and so what we're trying to do with this money is fill some gaps the federal government doesn't cover with their program and really accelerate getting to that 100 down, 20 up that we need for fast speed across the state.
And the use of the budget reserve, you can practically solve the budget right there without having to raise taxes or to dramatically cut spending. Was that an option?
If that's the budget, if you don't believe COVID's real, and if you don't believe we need to catch up with students, and you don't believe we need to make those investments coming out of this. I would remind folks, if you recall last January, when I put out the shortest supplemental budget in Minnesota history, pre-COVID, one page, and I said, I'm nervous of what's on the horizon. I'm nervous about what's happening in Europe, I think is what I said at that time, in Italy, and I think we should keep our budget reserves when we need them. Now, the proposal was to give that all back, to send that back. I would make the case again, it makes sense to use parts of them for the rainy day, but to just simply get back flat on the budget without recognizing that COVID has put us behind and also created opportunities for us, I think is the wrong way to go. So I think it's a combination of both. Use the budget reserves. Again, making sure that the vast majority of Minnesotans, if if you're not a millionaire or billionaire, your taxes aren't going up at all, just like they didn't last year. If you are, you did really well during COVID, and a lot of it has to do with those workers that we're reinvesting in. So,
Red tax, considered one of the most regressive taxes out there, but it's just a case of, will help public health as well, maybe to discourage.
it is public health, and I don't deny that, and vaping. We just have to get these two things out of there. And one of the things is we use the tax code to either incentivize or disincentivize behaviors. That's nothing surprising, and we're trying to do that. I would also say that a bulk of that cigarette tax goes to cessation programs and education programs, and that's a proactive way to reduce that down. I mean, prior to COVID, we were really getting this, and I want to acknowledge the advocates, which were a lot of the high school students that were really doing a great job of getting at that. But yes, that does hit folks, but we need to help them get off that. Ricardo.
This might be a quick answer, but I'm just curious what's the likelihood or appetite for a mid-year budget forecast, assuming Congress passes a COVID-19 relief package after the February forecast? I assume something like that would have a pretty material impact on the state of the budget.
Yes, yeah, I'll let you talk about them.
Thanks. It's a great question. I got to say, at this point, we're going to hopefully stick with the February forecast and keep that, knowing that that's sort of where we're at. Now, if there's a major federal action after the February forecast, that doesn't have to change the economic factors. It doesn't have to change the estimate of school enrollment or estimate of human services enrollment. And I'm sure at that point, we'll make sure that the governor reflects that information as well as the legislature.
Could there be perhaps even an abbreviated forecast that focuses on just the impact to the state budget if any of that aid comes through?
That's a good question. At this point, I would say no. Okay. And the simple reason is the forecast is a comprehensive document, tries to pull a lot of information together. Now, we can do that, and we will do that at the end of February. And that decision makers need some time to actually just understand that, and small changes here and there aren't the risks that we're facing today. The risks that we're facing today are COVID, recovery, and what's our path out.
Great. Commissioner, it says here, going to do $150 million in proposed spending cuts. Mm-hmm. Can you detail a couple of big ones there, or aren't there any big ones? Is it across the board small cuts?
There are a number of reductions, budget cuts in this budget recommendation. As you go into the detail, that MMB will be available on our website and in the governor's budget documents. You'll see them. One example is a 90-day dispensing of prescription drugs. We are learning all the time about different ways of doing things, and with this pandemic, we're starting to not do monthly prescription drug refills, but we're starting to stretch it out over 3 months. That we're proposing to continue that, and that's saving more than $11 million over the Department of Human Services. There's a number of smaller reductions all over the place. One of the things we've asked state agencies to do is to articulate and talk about some of those efficiencies and learnings that they've had over this year in their operating requests. So hopefully the budget documents will give you some more information of ideas along the way. I just want to say one other thing. There's the BRC, the Blue Ribbon Commission on Healthcare, that provided a lot of different ideas and basically included an assumed $100 million reduction in the forecast. We were by law asked to include that in the forecast, and either include it in the governor's recommendation or take more money out of the reserve. The governor's recommendation includes more than half of those recommendations. There is some money that we're taking out of the reserve for those that we didn't think were prudent at this point. But those are additional reductions that you'll find in the budget document.
Governor, can I ask you about a revenue source? There was a press conference today. A Democrat for sports betting. The estimates are this could bring in $50 million a year. Gaming is up nationwide. Do you have any interest in sports betting as a revenue source?
I will keep to my commitment on this. I'm open to hearing about it. I would ask us again, because of the nature of this, I would still like the legislators to take a look at recreational cannabis because of not just the revenue sources that are there that dwarf sports betting, but because of the equity issue and to be quite honestly, the racial impact of our cannabis laws. But I will say this, I will certainly leave open that possibility. Our neighboring states have done both of those things. Obviously recognize that that's not 100% slam dunk for people, and they realize that there's cost associated with both. But yeah, my message would be is I don't think this is the time for me to say I'm shutting the door on anything. So I'll hear.
Governor,
the tribes have been very much against that.
Pardon me?
Tribes have been very much against.
Depends how it's structured. Depends how it's structured. If they are part of that, they have come out as a proposal where the tribes are not part of it, just like our gambling in Minnesota exists now. They would certainly have to be part of that conversation to get that done.
Governor, with regard to the Stadium Reserve Fund, this is essentially the state reneging on an agreement that it had with the Vikings. And you're going to see...
I want to take that, Jim. I'm not sure I'd describe it that way, Dave.
Well, the purpose of the fund was to pay down the cost of the stadium, right? Not to supplement the rest of the budget. And you're going to, I'm assuming, get pushback from a level of bipartisanship in both chambers, certainly the Senate, and the Vikings themselves. I was wondering if you could give your best case for justifying that.
And I think I'll let Jim get into the specifics of it. I think it's the size of it. Nobody's saying that it shouldn't be. It was never intended that there would be 2.5 times the yearly operating expense would be in the stadium reserve. It does make sense prudently. That's what the initial agreement was. And so, Jim, you want to?
Happy to. I think the governor hit all the key points. The reserve is there to ensure that the state's appropriation bonds, which financed the stadium, are adequately financed, don't become an ongoing issue, an additional draw on general fund resources. That has been clearly achieved. There were just a few years ago where we were concerned whether the revenues were going to be enough to pay those appropriation bonds. We passed that. And then we passed that point as well. And so what this recommendation is doing is really to propose that we cap it so that we have more than enough for a year's payments. In fact, we have more than enough for 2 years' payments and still some left over, and make sure that the rest of the money is available for ongoing needs for the state. So that is the proposal. It leaves the financing for the stadium intact and more than amply financed in still better shape than it had been in previous years.
Hey, Commissioner, as long as you're up there, you and several other commissioners have had pay cuts in the past year. Does this proposal enable any public employee pay increases? Does this anticipate that there will be additional compensation out of the next 2-year contracts?
Great question, Brian. As you know, the operating budgets are dependent on labor contracts, other kinds of agreements that are reviewed by the legislature. Those contracts aren't going to be up for negotiation until later this spring and up for a review by the legislature until this summer, once they're set. There is funding in this budget, but it is well underneath even the rate of inflation. So, the answer is not much. We're really relying on agencies to make do, find ways to operate, and recognize that there's some costs that they can't avoid. One of the things that really important is that there are costs, some of the biggest costs in operating are past agreements. So our ability to continue our direct care and treatment, our correctional facilities, those were costs that both bodies, the governor, all agreed needed to keep going in one of the special sessions. But there's ongoing costs for that. So those are the kinds of costs that are particularly represented in this budget.
Not much is how much?
Not much. You would have to look at each agency. It is not an across-the-board scenario.
Well, thank you all. And to Minnesotans, this is a starting point. This is a budget that reflects Minnesota's sense that those who COVID hit the hardest, we need to help. It's also a Minnesota budget that says we help our own. It's also one that says we know our future lies in creating a world-class workforce by creating a world-class education system where every child can achieve. It asks folks to pay their fair share, but it recognizes the folks that were hit hardest by this. I would like to note historic investments in here in childcare, which we know is deeply concerning to the business community and to all Minnesotans. Incredible investments around affordable housing. And I'm going to, because she is not here, today is marking a memorial for Marvin Minniepenny from White Earth Nation, who happened to be an indigenous activist, also the father of Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, and she is in White Earth today. But she would always remind us that this is a fiscal document as well as a moral document, and it reflects the values of Minnesotans. It also reflects good, smart fiscal responsibility that we did in the last budget that carries over into this one. We are facing and have faced, because of COVID-19 as a nation, some of the deepest economic pain since the Great Depression. And Minnesotans, through grit, through determination, and just plain stubbornness have got us to a point where we're starting to turn this thing with vaccinations, with slowing the spread. We're hearing numbers today that we haven't seen around the spread of COVID since September. Now, we're not out of the woods, but we're in a pretty good spot. It would be catastrophic for us at this point to back away from this fight, to back away from the investments we need, to back away from good fiscal responsibility that puts us in a place when we come out of this and the economy starts to go and our children are back and things are happening, where Minnesota is the place where people want to go, and that we and they can see across not just the country but across the world. What happened to George Floyd in May changes how Minnesotans view this, and that lens of equity is a bright one that we're looking through every day, and this is a place where you want your children to grow up. White, brown, black, indigenous, doesn't matter. So thank you all. There's a lot of conversations to go, and we look forward to having them with Minnesotans. Thank you.